Hello everyone and welcome into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in on this Monday afternoon, but it is going to be kind of a bittersweet episode here on the show. We're going to be recapping the fantasy football season that was 2024. It has been an absolute honor and pleasure to be talking fantasy football with you throughout the course of the season, but some good things have to come to an end, and with it is this episode. We'll be ranking all the best players at each and every single position, from QB all the way on down to the defense and special teams units that shine this year, and it's going to be quite a thrilling ride to conclude the 2024 fantasy football season and hopefully get us looking forward to 2025, which should be yet another exciting, exhilarating year in the world of fantasy football. But without further ado, before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you, as always, to consider liking, following, and subscribing to both the show and the network if you haven't done so already, to get more content such as this. But if you want to contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way, as always, to get your opinions on air. You can also go to our website, GSMCpodcast.net, leave a tip, a donation, or questions, comments, or concerns you might have throughout the show there, and it just makes this show that much better. But without further ado, like I said, let's get into this fantasy football season recap, and what a thrilling ride it was, starting off at the QB position. Most important still in all of fantasy football, perhaps in all of fantasy sports, because having a good QB certainly does matter. Potentially not as much now as certain skill position players, which we'll talk about in later segments, but still, QB position always going to be one of the top performers for you, can get you across the finish line in any game, week in, week out. And these four guys, when we're talking about the best of the bunch this season, a couple surprises, but for the most part, this kind of very tight-knit big three at the top still remains. Guys still who have not won a Super Bowl just yet, but are trying to reach that pinnacle. Some falling a bit short, but some still with the opportunity to do so. And one young man breaking through into this top four, potentially going to be making a name for himself for many years to come in the National Football League. Without further ado, here are the top four best fantasy quarterbacks of the 2024 season. Starting off with that young man, the rookie sensation this past year, who's really come on the scene, led a surprising Washington Commanders team to the postseason against one of the most underrated matchups in the entire wild card round against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. What a swashbuckling affair that could turn out to be. But Jayden Daniels, let's talk about this human season, not just in real life, but in fantasy football. And I think the one thing that caught the eye of a lot of hopeful fantasy football owners when they decided to draft Jayden Daniels was the amount of calm and poise that he would be able to display in this Commanders offense. And it was coming through in spades from the moment he stepped on the football field for them. Led the league in completion percentage for quite some time. While he did not necessarily put up the gaudy touchdown numbers or the passing yard numbers a lot of people expect with sensational rookie season, much like what C.J. Stroud did just last year, or now 2 years ago, but he really displayed a level of calm and composure in this Washington Commanders system, and kudos to Cliff Kingsbury for getting him to that point, putting him in an offensive scheme that worked for his skill set, and ultimately got him outside the pocket, got him throwing the deep ball, and really made this Washington Commanders offense one of the most fun to watch in the National Football League. He averaged 22.5 fantasy points per game, finished with 360.6 fantasy points. While these numbers certainly are not necessarily the final numbers, I did write these before Week 18, but mostly knowing that a lot of these guys were going to be sitting out, these are around where their numbers were. His best week was in Week 16, 36.4 point performance. I believe that was against the Eagles in that crazy game where he threw a game-winning touchdown pass, finished with 5 touchdown passes in that one. So ultimately, just goes to show how dynamic this young man was for this Washington Commanders football team. A lot of fascinating performances, a lot of comeback wins against the Bears, against the Eagles, what have you. He is such an incredible athlete, and it's a pleasure to have seen him really come to life this season in his rookie year, and I hope that 2025 brings a sophomore season even better than this season. Hopefully he's not like CJ Stroud and begins to decline a little bit. But at number 4, best fantasy quarterbacks of the 2024 season, we have the young rookie here in Jaden Daniels. Congratulations to him. Now we get into this kind of top 3 that I was talking about. These 3 guys are the cream of the crop when it comes to fantasy football. These 3 guys will probably dictate the league. No matter whether or not they're going to win Super Bowls remains to be seen, but they still, at least in the regular season when fantasy football matters the most, deliver for you on a week-by-week basis, consistently and more consistently than a lot of guys in the NFL. Starting off at number 3, a young man who had a really unfortunate year in terms of his entire team's outlook, but still had one of the best, if not the best, years by a quarterback in recent memory, potentially in this decade thus far, in Joe Burrow. Led the league in passing yards, passing touchdowns, and nearly got to 5,000 this season. But unfortunately, it was all for naught for the Cincinnati Bengals this season, as the Broncos couldn't offer them any help in beating the very overwhelmed Chiefs reserves, even though the Jets did end up beating the Dolphins. And ultimately, the Cincinnati Bengals will miss the postseason yet again in the Joe Burrow era. But it's entirely not his fault. He did whatever he could to get his team to the postseason, even in moments where it looked really dire, where he seemingly was falling apart at the seams when his team was letting him down. And he ultimately brought this team to the precipice of the postseason, just behind his MVP caliber play alone. 23-point average in fantasy football this season, 367.8 total fantasy points this season. His best week was in Week 17 against the Denver Broncos in that had-to-have-it game. No, I believe that was actually the week before. I believe this was the game. It was the game against the Broncos where he really had one of his best performances of the season, 37 points there. And ultimately, just going to show that he can really put together good numbers, and it's all going to be up to his team to support him in his push to break through into the postseason and potentially winning his Super Bowl as he rightfully deserves for his level of play. But ultimately, congratulations to him for coming in third, but unfortunately he was not as good as these 2 guys who might just be battling it out for the MVP award this season, and rightfully so. 2 fascinating playoff squads we'll be talking about a lot in the coming weeks, especially as we look at them from a fantasy perspective right now, because of what they bring to the table from that said fantasy perspective. Starting off with number 2 player, Josh Allen. This year was all about limiting the turnovers and playing within this offense that really got him to appreciate what defenses gave him a little bit more. Gone with Stephon Diggs, so gone with the tension that came with having to force feed him the football. Now you really are incorporating these guys like Khalil Shakir, Curtis Samuel into the system. Yes, they went out and acquired Amari Cooper, but he really wasn't going to be the focal point of this offense, and really got it into a very complimentary state, where it's still putting up very nice numbers offensively in terms of points scored, but also compensating for the worst of what Josh Allen had to offer, which turnovers, which turns into an MVP caliber season for him, and especially from a fantasy perspective where a lot of people love his dual threat ability and what that means for their fantasy teams. 24.1 fantasy points per game average this season, 385 total points. Best week was in Week 11. I believe that was the week where he had the crazy numbers, where he was one of the first QBs to rush for 3 touchdowns, pass for 3 touchdowns, 51.9 points in that one. Just goes to show how electrifying he can be when he's on his game. Hopefully, it shows up in the postseason yet again. He has one of the tougher 7-2 matchups in recent history against a very feisty Denver Broncos squad with a very feisty scoring defense who's going to have to protect the football in that one. But I'm really looking forward to seeing how this play in the regular season translates to postseason success for Josh Allen and these Buffalo Bills as they search for their first ever Super Bowl. So kudos to him for finishing number 2. But at number 1, potentially the presumptuous MVP favorite, and rightfully so. Even though Josh Allen gave him a good run, I do believe these past couple of weeks has cemented his status as the three-time winner of this award thus far. Potentially we could have a tie, but I don't see how you can award it outright to this young man, Lamar Jackson. Yes, people are still going to criticize him for not winning the Super Bowl if he doesn't this year, and he wins the MVP award again this season, which will make him the only three-time MVP winner to have not won the Super Bowl. But ultimately, we can't deny the incredible, electrifying play he brings to the table in the regular season from a fantasy perspective. Because in fantasy sports, this is the guy for you. This is one of the best players in all fantasy sports, bar none. And he just delivers on a week-by-week basis no matter what. 25.7 point average this season, 411.4 total fantasy points. His best week was in week 15. Yes, it was against the Giants, but still 36.1 fantasy points in a singular game is nothing to sneeze at the quarterback position. And it just goes to show that in this very congested QB class, this QB tier, where these guys are trying to separate themselves as the big three in this National Football League. These big three that really haven't won a Super Bowl. Lamar Jackson has really become the pivotal prototype of what it could mean to be a QB in this league for the next decade. He brings a dual threat ability to the table that really adds balance and really complements the style of play of this Baltimore offense so well. And the addition of Derrick Henry, for no matter how long he plays, is going to be big for him as he matures into this role in this system. But ultimately, this season was just a coming out party for Lamar Jackson as one of, if not the best young QBs in the NFL. Potentially, if he wins the Super Bowl, also becoming the face of the National Football League for many years to come. So congratulations to all these players who made this list, because this is going to be one of the positions to watch for many years to come here in the National Football League. But let me know what you think in the comments about these top 4 players and what they could look like come postseason time outside of, unfortunately, Joe Burrow. But coming next, we talk with the best fantasy running backs this season in one of the better positions as well in all of fantasy football. So we'll be right back after that short break to talk about it.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows with 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you yet again, if you wish to contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way, as always, to get your opinions out there on air. You can do the same through our website as well, GSMCpodcast.net. You can either leave a tip or donation or any questions, comments, or concerns you have about the show. Just makes it that much better and really gets you all involved as well. But without further ado, let us get into our second segment, continuing the theme of ranking the best players at each position in this 2024 fantasy football season with the running back position. And what a revolution we saw at the position this season. Kind of running back renaissance. A lot of these older players finding new homes and revitalizing their careers, potentially younger guys getting a new opportunity or a renewed opportunity to really make a name for themselves in their respective offenses. So you kind of see that balance in these ranking of this top 4, but ultimately 2 guys that made the most noise you are already all too familiar with seeing at the top of these kinds of rankings. But the two guys at the bottom could define this next generation of running backs as just as much as these two guys had defined theirs. So without further ado, let us talk about them, starting off with the number 4 guy here, Bijan Robinson. A lot of talk about what his season could look like with new head coach Raheem Morris. A lot of talk from Raheem Morris in terms of Bijan being able to get the ball more, using him a lot more in certain situations, and he turned it into a pretty decent season. However, when I was watching the Falcons this season, it just seemed that Bijan Robinson, for the most part, seemed to have a disconnect between himself and the offensive line. It definitely plays into his style of play, potentially being part of the problem in that he just waits to make that one cut up field to try and gain that advantage in terms of his north to south running style, but ultimately it hasn't really worked as well as I thought it would with this offensive line, and it could be kind of a detriment to the future of him in this offense, but ultimately it's because of his skill set alone, because of his ability to also receive out of the backfield alone, that just makes him such a high upside player, and the reason why he's paying dividends for a lot of fantasy football owners this season. 15.7 point average, 251.54 total fantasy points this season for Bijan Robinson. So hopefully he continues to grow into this new look offense. Ultimately, if Michael Penix is going to be the QB of the future for Atlanta, look for him to heavily rely upon Bijan Robinson to truly complement what he can do. As we've seen over these past couple of weeks, he definitely finished with a bang, Bijan, in that game against Carolina yesterday, really carrying the load. So maybe that could be a harbinger of things to come for this Atlanta Falcons offense. And if so, I'm excited to see what it brings. So congratulations to Bijan Robinson. Even in a situation and system where I don't necessarily see the fit as much as other people, I still believe that he's going to be a truly fascinating fantasy player to follow for the next decade or so as he grows with this Atlanta Falcons offense. But congratulations to him for being the number 4 player. The number 3 player is even more interesting because this guy was in a 2 running back system until his partner went down with injury just a couple of weeks ago. That will see him be the RB1 heading into the postseason for the Detroit Lions. Yes, Jahmyr Gibbs is the number 3 running back this season, and his performance last night against Minnesota to clinch the number 1 seed in the NFC was heavy proof of why. Jahmyr Gibbs is one of those guys that, yes, has to kind of compete with David Montgomery for touches in the system. But I do believe that he's the more explosive back of the two when he gets into the open field, whether it be running out of the backfield or an outside zone runs, or receiving the football out of the backfield, kind of adding a nice complementary piece to the passing game for Jared Goff there as well. 16.9 fantasy points per game average, 269.9 total fantasy points this season. Ultimately, you had to add in his almost 50-point performance last night. I was kind of sweating it out in my 5th place game in my own fantasy league for the way Jahmyr Gibbs performed in fantasy last night. So we're going to have to add that big total to his numbers as well this season. And it could see him potentially surpass Derrick Henry, even though Derrick Henry had a pretty nice game himself in this last week. And we'll talk about him a little later in the segment. But ultimately, what I love about Jahmyr Gibbs is that this season saw him step up in a huge way for this Lions offense. I was really thinking that this Lions offense was kind of seeing a transition from this very balanced attack to one in which Jared Goff was comfortable carrying the load as a passer. And at certain points, he certainly was. Hyper efficient against blitzes, hyper efficient against pressures, finding so many different ways along with offensive coordinator Ben Johnson to dissect opposing defense, especially in that very tough and physical NFC North. But ultimately, the reason why this Detroit Lions team could be the presumptive favorite to go to the Super Bowl for the first time in their history is because of the running attack and how Ben Johnson really implemented it to perfection this season. Yes, I'm kind of interested to see how he looks sans David Montgomery, as he's going to get a much bigger load, much bigger usage rate come postseason time. But I do feel like Jahmyr Gibbs is one of those players and one of those running backs that I really am excited to see grow in this Lions offense and throughout his NFL career. He's going to be someone who I heavily monitor throughout his career, both in real life and fantasy, just because of what he brings to the table for Detroit as a true contender for as long as he stays there. So ultimately, congratulations 2, Jahmyr Gibbs finishing as RB3 this season in the 2024 fantasy football season. Now let's talk about the two guys that dominated the headlines at the running back position, really creating and coining the term running back renaissance, finding new homes even as they're getting up there in age, or no matter how you see it, entering their primes perhaps with these new teams. Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry. Let's start with the RB2 of the season, Derrick Henry. 18.1 fantasy points per game average, 289.5 or 284.5 fantasy points overall for Derrick Henry, plus that tremendous game he had in the last week of the season. But ultimately, Derrick Henry was someone who I was completely wrong about this season. I truly thought that he was going to struggle this season against this very physical AFC North group of defenses and really wouldn't transition very well to the style of offense the Ravens wanted to play. Because I really thought that by having two guys in J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards, that they would add a nice dynamic in the backfield to counterbalance whatever Lamar Jackson did. And it just created a lot of pace, a lot of speed in this offensive scheme for Baltimore that not a lot of teams could end up stopping. But bringing in a guy like Derrick Henry gave me pause because of the fact that he would slow a lot of things down. Boy, was I wrong. He really was someone who stepped up to the plate for this Baltimore Ravens offense in more ways than one, just because of his physical style of play. They could really run him out there in any situation and know that his physicality would wear down opposing defenses, thus lining up boxes, thus allowing Lamar to get going in both the design run and passing game, and ultimately cementing himself as still one of the running backs to watch for as long as he's in the NFL for these next couple of years. Because of the fact that his style of running you can't necessarily teach defending, because he can just run over you, he can just wear you down, wear you out, and ultimately win football games on his own, no matter the situation. And that's what he showed this season, that no matter what your style of running is, you can be dynamic as you get up there in age as a running back still. And I'm really excited to see how long his tenure in Baltimore is and how long he can stay this premier running back who can define his generation for years to come. But unfortunately, he was just not as good as this young man in Philly, staying in the NFC East, betraying that New York Giants fan base. And I know how much heartbreak they're going through as someone who lives in the tri-state area because of this whole situation with him. But Saquon Barkley certainly enjoying life in Philly just as much as he did in New York, even though that was a pretty tenuous relationship there with all the injuries he went through and how the organization viewed him. So it's good to see Saquon in a nice, healthy place, having a full season of play, nearly breaking Eric Dickerson's single-season rushing record. Unfortunately, Nick Sirianni is deciding to rest him for the postseason. But I truly believe that Saquon Barkley has become the definitive RB1 in this running back renaissance. He's leading the surge as being this guy who comes into Philly, really stakes his claim as the best player on this offense, and this really talented offense at that, with Jalen Hurts, this potent offensive line, A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith as one of the best wide receiver tandems in all of football, and really saying, hey, I'm going to be the focal point of this offense. I'm going to lead us to new horizons, and I'm really going to complement what you want to do super well in this offense. And ultimately, he did just that to the point where he nearly broke the single-season rushing record. And yes, there would be speculation of whether or not it would be a legitimate record because Eric Dickerson took shorter. I think it would have been had he set the record, but ultimately, the record's not what matters. What matters is this kind of definitive statement to the rest of the NFL that Saquon is still someone who is a force in the league that you have to look out for and you have to account for. 20.1 fantasy points per game average, 322.3 fantasy points, so still a lot more than Derrick Henry, as you see, thus cementing himself as the outright RB1. Unfortunately, potentially not enough to really boost his MVP candidacy in terms of going up against guys like Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson at the QB position. Had he potentially have gotten that record in a nice looking fashion, then maybe he would have a better case, but ultimately he wouldn't have been beating them anyways. But still, a tremendous running back season for Saquon Barkley, truly showing that this running back position is deeper than a lot of people think. You just have to dig deep and find different guys who you feel can break out or still retain their potency as they get up in age there, reaching their peaks, like Saquon and Derrick Henry, with new teams, ultimately a new reference point for how to view the running back position for years to come. Let me know what you think in the comments about the running back position this season. It's going to be one of the most important running back positions for years to come, but ultimately, once we come back from break, we're going to be talking about a position group that's kind of regressing just a little bit to the mean here. The wide receiver position, not too many guys looking that elite this year, but ultimately still a very deep position group. We'll be right back after the break to talk about it as well.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of the day, we're going to keep on rolling in this fantasy football season recap, talking about the best fantasy wide receivers this season. The wide receiver position really was a weird one to analyze throughout this season if you are, like me, a fantasy football pundit looking at this position group, just because of how bizarre it ended up finishing. Not too many elite performers at the wide receiver position this season. This top four, though, really has cemented it as a really nice group of wide receivers you can rely upon week in, week out on a consistent basis as a fantasy football owner, but not really showing its depth as much as I thought it would this year. There was a really exciting rookie class, actually a rookie amongst this top four, surprisingly, but ultimately not too many young guys really having breakout seasons, or guys in those middle tiers we talked about before the season started really separating themselves in the pack either. But this is a really, like I said, solid group. I mean, not as solid as years past, but still a group that will grow throughout the next 5 years, potentially the next decade, and mature to be one of the better wide receiver position groups we see in many years. So without further ado, let's talk about the wide receiver position group in a pretty down year for it. Starting off at number 4, talking about that rookie. Potentially not the rookie a lot of people would have expected to see here, but still potentially going to be one of, if not the best wide receivers from this rookie class for his entire career, if they get their head coaching position right, because that's a big deal as well. Brian Thomas Jr., a really impressive year. Yes, potentially some would say Malik Neighbors' season in New York was a little bit more impressive than Brian Thomas Jr.'s season in Jacksonville. Let me remind you that Jacksonville was not necessarily a spot where elite wide receiver play was expected. Yes, they had a lot of talent in the group, but not necessarily talent that I feel would have translated into a breakout season for many of them. But Brian Thomas Jr. lived up to his draft expectations thus far, and hopefully if they get the head coaching job right, the position right, and Trevor Lawrence gets rejuvenated a little bit, revitalized, he becomes even more of a threat to the AFC South and rest of the NFL. 11.7 point average this season, 186.7 total fantasy points this season for Brian Thomas Jr. And remember, he was doing most of his good work with Mac Jones at the QB position. So if he can do that with Mac Jones, just imagine with a new head coach and a new offensive scheme, what he can do next year with Trevor Lawrence is one of the best throwers of the deep ball in the National Football League. So kudos to Brian Thomas Jr. for really showing what he can do in his rookie season as one of the potentially breakout stars of the NFL over the next decade or so. Hopefully, for Jacksonville Jaguars fans and for this organization, they can get off on the right foot next year in 2025, getting things right there for Brian Thomas Jr. and Trevor Lawrence to be a nice little tandem. But let's get into the regularly scheduled guys here in the top three. Not necessarily the best of seasons for all three of these guys, not living up to their lofty standards that we've seen in past years, but still, like I said, solid for the wide receiver position. Remember, the wide receiver position kind of regressing a little bit, so don't expect too much out of these top scorers here. Definitely not the lofty numbers that guys in the running back and QB positions are putting up, but still solid numbers for this group. Maybe not as good as you would expect from them, but still, these three are separating themselves from the pack in terms of their play. Let's start off at number 3, a guy who I had on my personal fantasy team, potentially someone who I'd have wished for a better season from, but still an elite receiver, one of the best route runners in the NFL, especially on late downs. Amon-Ra St. Brown, 12.1 fantasy points per game average, 193.5 total points for Amon-Ra this season. Yes, very much a down year from his all-pro year in terms of production, but ultimately, when I think about him and the rest of this position, I feel like someone of his ilk and someone of his value should not be too nonplussed with this season. Just because I feel like he has the pedigree, he has the offense that can get him into a nice solid groove. They just didn't rely on him as much this season. When I look at all of these receivers, they're in situations where they are, without a doubt, the wide receiver one, but they're in offenses, right, where they're forced to kind of either fall by the wayside for some games or be the focal point. They're not necessarily guys who really are looking to put up superstar numbers. They're really looking to complement their offenses at this juncture. Guy like Brian Thomas Jr. potentially could be someone who becomes the superstar wide receiver who's all about numbers, but for now, that's what he is in this Jacksonville Jaguars. And the same thing goes for Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's someone who's going to complement the best happenings of this offense. And when this offense isn't a groove, sometimes it's not because of Amon-Ra. It's because Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery are running the ball well. It's because Jared Goff is remaining hyper-efficient, passing to this multifaceted wide receiver core for Detroit. Because it's not just about Amon-Ra St. Brown. It's about guys like Jameson Williams. It's about guys like Sam Laporta. It's about guys like Khalif Raymond. It's about guys like Tim Patrick. So Amon-Ra may not necessarily be a receiver who's going to be attractive in terms of gaudy stats year in, year out, but he's still someone who's a solid wide receiver for you and will still go very high in first rounds of mock drafts year in, year out because of his status as a Detroit Lion, as someone who can put up any amount of good numbers week in, week out, just because he is in this Detroit Lions offense system is the reason why potentially we could see his numbers decline a little bit year in, year out. Then let's go to number 2 on this list, Justin Jefferson, another guy who saw a little bit of decline in fantasy production this season, still an elite receiver, but in a year where they transitioned quarterbacks to a guy in Sam Darnold who they just wanted to gain comfortability in this system. Justin Jefferson played a major part in opening up a lot of avenues for this new look Vikings offense. So while he only averaged 13.1 fantasy points per game and 209.1, think about all those Vikings, guys like Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson, Brandon Powell, Jalen Naylor, who had fantastic seasons because of the work Justin Jefferson does on a week-by-week basis, creating space for them to operate. He's willing to sacrifice his role as that elite superstar level receiver that a lot of people are looking for in fantasy for the sake of the overall outlook of this Minnesota Vikings team. And that was why this Minnesota Vikings team is so potent offensively. It's not just focused entirely on the success of Justin Jefferson. It's focused on a well-rounded offensive attack. Yes, it did not look the sum of its parts against Detroit last night, but in the playoffs, just know this team is still going to be feisty and dangerous no matter what happens to it, because Justin Jefferson has become a lot more versatile these past couple of years in terms of how he plays in the system. When I think of the future of the wide receiver position. And when I talk about what I mean when I say that the wide receiver position could regress to the mean, and we could see a lot of these top receivers really decline a little bit because of their offensive output. When I think of a guy like Justin Jefferson, he is in a weird place because I still think this Vikings QB situation is undefined. I do hope that Sam Darnold finds a home, whether or not it be by remaining with Minnesota or trying his luck in free agency. But ultimately, I don't really know the future of the QB position, and it could remain murky during this offseason. But when I think about what Justin Jefferson could do for whatever quarterback he has for as long as his NFL career lasts, he truly is a special talent, because this Minnesota Vikings offense has evolved in a manner in which I feel a lot of NFL offenses might want to follow that blueprint. Just get your QB comfortable and efficient in a system that really doesn't necessarily speak to one player carrying the load. Because that's what I saw this NFL season. A couple of teams tried hard, teams like the Bengals, to pretty much a lot of success offensively, not in terms of winning football games. The Seahawks, ultimately because they really were forced to. All these teams trying to develop potent passing attacks, but not necessarily sustaining them because they didn't have the resources to sustain them for as long as they did. And so a guy like Justin Jefferson, all these receivers, are guys who know what it means to be the focal point of their offense, but also know what it means to be in a well-rounded system that brings out the best in their QB. And if those teams continue to succeed in that, these wide receivers, even though they're not putting up the numbers you would want them to, would still give you solid performances because they're in both mindsets, right? They know they can take over a game at any time, but they also know that they have other guys around them who can really step up should they be struggling. So that's what I think about a guy like Justin Jefferson and potentially a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown over these next couple of years. They're still going to be premier wide receivers, and they're still going to offer you a lot of value. But right now, it's more about team success in the NFL from what I've seen, rather than trying to get the best out of one individual player. And that's the case, I believe, at the very least, for our wide receiver one this season, Ja'Marr Chase. And not for nothing, this is no indictment of Ja'Marr Chase or the Cincinnati Bengals offense. It's more of an indictment of how the NFL is working right now. Because, yes, some of the time, passing to win football games works, and it should, because passing ultimately generates more explosive plays, more EPA per play, ultimately is the most exciting aspect of an NFL game week in, week out. But when you look at the Cincinnati Bengals this season and all their success in terms of their offensive output, it's more about, them really struggling to develop an identity outside of that. Really focusing on getting the most production out of their superstar weapons rather than trying to examine what they can do as a whole team. And maybe it stems down to, yes, they had to be forced to pass the football more than they would like, and Joe Burrow was more than capable of doing that throughout the season. But ultimately, it did not stand out because they couldn't necessarily complement their entire team, right? They couldn't compensate for this lack of defensive prowess. They couldn't compensate for, teams matching their offensive output week in, week out, and thus that's why they find themselves on the sidelines this postseason. But Ja'Marr Chase, Triple Crown winner for the receiving this season, 60.3 fantasy points per game average, 260.4 fantasy points overall. So ultimately, a fantastic year for him. He's going to continue to put up big numbers, but in an offense that really, I feel like, should try and at least evolve a little bit more away from just having passing be the focal point of it, because you want to take that pressure off Joe Burrow to get him to a place where Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson are, where they're perfectly complemented by these new look offenses for them. So if they get to that point, then look for Ja'Marr Chase to be one of those receivers who just complements his offense very nicely and is still a solid fantasy receiver. But ultimately, for now, Ja'Marr Chase, if you're looking for that big stats guy, is your guy. Let me know what you think about the wide receiver position in the comments below, because it is a very interesting position to discuss. But coming in, as we talk about the tight end position and how wrong I was in the off-season beforehand about the development of this position. We'll be right back after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows. Available.
Hello everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of the day, we're talking about our fourth position group, the tight end position. And I want to make one stipulation before we get into this one. Remember before the season how I said that there would begin to be a vanguard of two opposing schools of the tight end position, the old guard and the new guard, where you would have to decide between whether or not you trust an old guard member to retain their value as a fantasy option, or one of these new guard players as a breakout candidate. Well, this season really didn't necessarily sum that point up that much, because these top four players really are a weird amalgamation. You have some of those new guard guys I was talking about, and you have one of those old guard guys, and you have someone who you would not have expected to see in this top four. So ultimately, this tight end picture became very muddled as the year went on. But ultimately, it was one of the more fun positions to analyze. I'm glad that I got it wrong, because I'm really excited to see the evolution of the tight end position for years to come, not just in this period of time and over the next decade, because a lot of these new guard players who really look like they're up for it to challenge what this older hierarchy has been doing these past 5 years. So without further ado, let's talk about this very exhilarating tight end position, shall we? Starting off with the one surprise in the tight end rankings this year, a guy who a lot of people did not have on their radars on a team which is not known for its tight end production at all. But how about Jonnu Smith? Jonnu Smith was someone who, for the Miami Dolphins, has really stepped up in terms of the passing game. After, anemic couple of weeks, the Dolphins' passing game did not look like it would have much direction, but then all of a sudden up steps Jonnu Smith and immediately becomes one of the leading receivers of this team over the past couple of weeks. Ultimately, the Dolphins coming up short of the postseason, but Jonnu Smith, a really special player, a hidden gem amongst tight ends this season. 7.8 points per game average, 124.7 total fantasy points this season at the tight end position. Again, a guy who, yes, was a breakout star, but not necessarily in a way that really jumps off the page, but still someone who next year, if the Dolphins are really struggling to develop their passing game outside of, their big weapons, then Jonnu Smith could have another breakthrough year yet again. There's a reason why he's someone who a lot of NFL head coaches had high hopes about coming into this season beforehand. So congratulations to a guy like Jonnu Smith, really altering the perception of the tight end position, really altering my perception of this old guard, new guard, as someone who just broke through without, any sense of warning here, because I could not have envisioned mentioning him in the top four tight ends of any fantasy football season. But here we find him after an incredible second half of the season. Now let's talk about a guy who I really had high hopes for, still got into this top four, but not necessarily in the most appealing of ways. Trey McBride. This was someone who I really loved coming into this season as perhaps the ultimate dark horse in all of fantasy football. A guy who I really thought would be the difference on any given Sunday for you on a week-by-week basis, but ultimately didn't necessarily live up to those gaudy touchdown numbers I put up. In fact, only scored one touchdown this season in that Week 17 matchup against Los Angeles, so that was a huge disappointment. But still, an impressive season nonetheless for this Arizona Cardinals kind of stop-start offense here, When he was on, he was on. When he was off, this entire Cardinals offense was off, because he truly is one of the biggest receiving threats in the entirety of that Arizona Cardinals offense. So when he wasn't clicking, then ultimately this Arizona Cardinals offense fell flat. But ultimately, he was clicking more often than not this season for this Arizona Cardinals attack, to a tune of 8.9 fantasy points, 126.3 overall fantasy points. And the thing about a guy like Trey McBride is that he is going to be someone who, whether or not the Cardinals really mature as a football team, will be seen as someone who truly defines the position in a way that really will appeal to a lot of fantasy football owners who take this thing seriously. Because Trey McBride is not necessarily going to be in the spotlight that often. He's still someone who I feel like gets overshadowed by a lot of players in his position. And the fact that he only had one touchdown all season is not going to help matters in terms of getting his name out there to a wider fan base. But ultimately, for those who are savvy, and for those who jumped on the hype train before it even took off, I do believe that Trey McBride is going to eventually pay off in a big way for all those who has invested in him. And he already is. The fact that he got to this talented position with one singular touchdown all year, let's go to show the value he adds to this Arizona Cardinals offense. Yes, you can imagine this Arizona Cardinals offense is going to improve outside of just giving the ball to him. They have weapons like James Conner in the backfield, Marvin Harrison Jr., Michael Wilson, and guys of that ilk. And so Trey McBride might see a little bit of regression next season. And the reason why he maintains this sensibility as a premier tight end is because of the fact that a lot of people still might not be paying attention to him and may not even realize how good he looks to be for the rest of his NFL career as this young Arizona Cardinals offense starts to grow and develop. So that's why I'm really, really stoked to see how Trey McBride looks in the future, because the sky's the limit for him. Even if this Arizona offense is kind of stuck in this state of stagnancy for the time being, because that just means that heightened targets will come for him. That just means more over-reliance on him will happen. And even though a lot of positions rely on more complementary style of play, the tight end position is just up for grabs, because all of these guys are not going to be your top point getters week in, week out, right? But if a guy like Trey McBride were to separate himself from the pack as someone who gets a lot of targets, then ultimately, why not pay attention to him now? Because he adds a lot of value to what this tight end position could mean in terms of what I mean by saying old guard, new guard in the future as well. So look for Trey McBride to be still a guy who can maintain this status as a premier tight end, a top fantasy tight end for you for years to come in this Arizona Cardinals offense. And speaking of big targets, let's go to our tight end 2 this season. One of the new guard guys who broke out in a big way. Gonna be the future and face of this position for years to come. How about Brock Bowers? Guy plays like a wide receiver. His intuition at the tight end position is bar none for a rookie nonetheless, playing in an anemic Raiders offense with two quarterbacks who truly aren't the answer there in Las Vegas. But hopefully this year in the draft, they can pick up a guy like Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders, put him in a situation that allows for him to get the ball to a guy like Brock Bowers, and he can pay dividends. Brock Bowers this season set the single season record for receiving yards by a tight end in the rookie season, surpassing the legendary Mike Ditka, had the most targets of any tight end in the rookie season, and a fact I just learned today, had more targets in one season in the NFL alone than Travis Kelce has had in any of his Hall of Fame career-like seasons. That's a huge stat to remember. Travis Kelce has never had as many targets as Brock Bowers, 112 in any singular season of his career, and he's one of the most legendary tight ends of all time. But Brock Bowers is someone who I really think will stand the test of time. And I feel like the Raiders are a team that's going to be steadily improving for years to come. I feel like by picking up, whether it be Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders in this year's draft, will set them right, give them a good foundation for their future. Yes, they're going to need to really bolster this defense as well, kind of complement and balance things out. But ultimately, by getting it right with Brock Bowers in this year's draft, picking the best player available, I do feel they have set the foundation for a very special offense there in Las Vegas. And Brock Bowers, with a total of 8.7 fantasy points per game average, a total of 139.7 overall, really gives you this kind of player who transcends position, whether it be as one of those inline tight ends, whether it be as a blocker, whether it be as a receiving threat in the slot, on the outside. This guy can line up anywhere, and he immediately becomes a true mismatch for opposing defenses. And in the AFC West, a division that's steadily improving, now has 3 teams in the postseason there, you're going to want a guy like Brock Bowers to steadily grow as the years go on. And I feel like the Raiders can get this right. I feel like the Raiders are on the precipice of something that can start to look like the development of a stellar football team. Brock Bowers is one step. Now they just need to continuously take some more steps to get to that point as well. So that's why I feel like this comes as no surprise to me as Brock Bowers breaks into the tight end top 4 ranks for fantasy football as well. Let's talk about the number 1 player. And this number 1 player may kind of surprise a couple people, a member of that old guard hierarchy, but still a guy I really respect as someone who really has made a name for himself at the tight end position in the NFL, George Kittle. This is someone who has had a very interesting career, had his fair share of injuries throughout his career, has had his fair share of criticism, scrutiny throughout his NFL career, but ultimately has risen to every challenge that has come his way. And this season was a challenging season for the San Francisco 49ers. A lot of injuries to overcome, a lot of external noise surrounding this franchise now, but George Kittle has proved he is a paragon of consistency for this team no matter what. Can deliver for you no matter what circumstances are, ultimately cementing himself as a guy who you can't forget about once this old guard ends up retiring. Yes, you're going to remember guys like Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, potentially a little bit more, but George Kittle deserves to be remembered in that same breath as well, because he really has been the premier tight end in my mind in terms of really evolving what this position may become. If it weren't for Brock Bowers already being in this top 4 position rankings at the tight end position, I'll be saying that George Kittle will be the blueprint for Brock Bowers' career. Someone who is going to come under a lot of scrutiny, has had to battle through a lot of tough circumstances throughout his career, but ultimately has been someone who you cannot deny. And I feel like that is the foundation for Brock Bowers. So that's why I'm so glad that these two finished 1-2 this season in fantasy, because when I look at Brock Bowers, I think of a mini George Kittle for many different reasons. 1, because of their physicality. 2, because of their ability to really create a mismatch in the open field. They don't necessarily have the best speed, but they're 2 guys who you want to bring down because they can create so many yards after catch opportunities in their respective offenses. And George Kittle this year, yes, his team did not perform with him as well on the football field, but he still remains someone I have huge respect for because of the blueprint he's laying for this new guard. When I think about Travis Kelce, yeah, I feel like he's off in his own little world. Mark Andrews is in an offense where, yes, he can be a difference maker week in, week out, but ultimately it revolves around Lamar and Derrick Henry. When I look at guys like George Kittle and Brock Bowers, I feel like they truly can be the solution when their teams are struggling. And George Kittle proved to be that in spades in this very dire San Francisco 49ers season. 11.1 fantasy points per game average, 155.9 points overall. And yes, this wasn't necessarily the best of years for the tight end position. But the fact that George Kittle, a guy who by hook or by crook has become one of the better tight ends in the National Football League, is deservedly the tight end one this season. And kudos to all these tight ends, because the tight end position is so difficult to diagnose in fantasy. And if you get it wrong, yeah, you might not be as mad at yourself as you are if you got wrong, say, the wide receiver or running back positions. But there's still a position that can swing games in your favor week in, week out. And ultimately, I'm really excited and stoked to see how it develops, because there are some guys in here who I was not expecting to see, and maybe these guys will fall out in the future. But ultimately, this top 4 is a microcosm of what this position can become for the NFL and for fantasy football owners everywhere. So let me know what you think about it in the comments below. But coming up next, we conclude our fantasy football season recap with my favorite position of all, the defense and special teams units that shined all year long. Which surprise team sits at the top in those rankings right after this short break? Hello everyone, and welcome back into the final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, and it is talking about one of my favorite positions in all of fantasy sports. Maybe not your favorite positions when it comes to drafting in fantasy football, but the defense and special teams units certainly are mine, just because of the way we've seen them rise and evolve these past couple of seasons. Truly becoming just one of the positions that really helps you really swing games in your favor these past couple of years. And all 4 of these defenses potentially going to be defensive units you might want to monitor for the next 5 years or so. Some of these defenses are familiar, some of these potentially not, but ultimately a top 4 that really will, in a couple of years, stand the test of time in my opinion, because a lot of these defenses have room to improve and evolve even further should their defensive coordinators stick with them, because ultimately most of these defensive coordinators deserve to have jobs as head coaches in the NFL or even in college football. But ultimately, this top 4 I'm really excited to talk about. So without further ado, let's jump right into it, starting off with the number 4 defense. Kind of a down year for them. As we'll see, the Pittsburgh Steelers, only 8.6 fantasy points per game average, under 37. I decided to stream them this season, and they really, over these past couple of weeks, kind of steadily decline. We see a lot more lapses and miscommunications within this defense than we have seen in recent memory for a lot of these Pittsburgh Steelers defenses we've talked about. And I'm reading this stat when we talk about all the playoff teams ESPN just released an article about that says that they gave him an average of 380.5 yards and 27.3 points in that 4-game span where they played a lot of those games during the holiday season against the top NFL teams with the Eagles, Ravens, Chiefs back-to-back. And yes, those are a tough group of teams to beat in any given circumstance. But you are the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. This is one of the top defenses in the entire National Football League we're talking about. Yes, they still lead the league in takeaways, and I love the look of the secondary when they're healthy, right? Because Dante Jackson was a big missing part of this defense, and ultimately we saw them decline a little bit because of that absence. But still, this is a defense that I feel like has slowly been on the downfall these past couple of weeks, and ultimately over the next couple of years we could see them fall out of the top 10 entirely should this continue. And I feel like this season is a microcosm of the best and worst of what you can get from the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. You can get the improvement of this very talented secondary, but then you start to see some lapses once key pieces go missing from it. So look for this Pittsburgh Steelers defense to surprisingly drop down the rankings from a fantasy and real life perspective for the next couple of years, especially if they decide to transition out of the season to a new head coaching regime, because I don't necessarily feel like Mike Tomlin's sustained success can be repeated with a new head coach. So look for this team to steadily decline a little bit, especially on the defensive side of the football, but they still sit at number 4 for what they brought to the table in terms of takeaways. Speaking of takeaways, let's talk about the Green Bay Packers, our number 3 defense for the 2024 fantasy football season. And this is a team that also was very astonishing when it came to taking the football away. Very talented secondary led by Xavier McKinney and Jair Alexander. Even though he missed through injury, he's going to be a big miss for them come the postseason. But ultimately, this is a team that I really feel really stuck with their identity throughout the entire regular season in terms of their defense. They took the football away and forced teams to really have to think about how they retain possession against them. They really, really, really impressed me in terms of how they helped this offense and how they really helped win the time possession battle, most importantly. Seahawks, I was really impressed by the time possession that was afforded them, by how their defense played, both in their front and in their secondary as well. And so that's why I feel like this Packers defense, while I continuously kind of decide to shun them away and have them fall by the wayside for the year, still was very impressive in terms of how they continued to surprise people by taking the football away. And I feel like, it could be a harbinger of things to come for this Packers team, because I feel like even though they are getting older in their secondary a little bit, their front is getting younger. And if the front improves and the secondary declines, then that could give chances to a younger secondary. And the secondary depth in the next couple of drafts is looking pretty enticing. So I still believe that even if some kind of imbalance between these two defensive groups for the Packers starts to show up, I do feel like they will have the capital to compensate for it, potentially make it up through the next couple of off seasons, should that be the case. But ultimately, I'm really excited and stoked to see the future of this Packers defense, especially in this postseason, seeing as to how, they didn't play well against the NFC's elite. They were 0-5 against the Eagles, Vikings, and Lions this season. So I really want to see how this defense translates in the very tough gauntlet that is the NFC postseason. Because if they show me enough against teams like the Eagles, who they'll be playing in the wildcard round, and if they win, then the Lions and Vikings and teams of that nature, then that will prove to me that this defense can really translate their success from this season to the next season as well, and for many seasons thereafter. But for now, I feel like this defense, it has to stay predicated with their identity of taking the football away. And that's what got them here in the first place. So kudos to this Green Bay Packers defense for really sticking with their identity, sticking with their MO, and forcing opposing offenses' hands all year long. But speaking of NFC North defenses, they were not as good as one of my dad's favorite teams in the league's defense. Kudos to them. The Minnesota Fighting Vikings, 9.8 fantasy points per game average, 157 total fantasy points there. Truly one of my favorite defenses to watch in all of the NFL, especially because of one of the defensive masterminds of the season, Brian Flores. Give this man another chance at a head coaching job, and I guarantee you he'll become one of the most fearsome head coaches in the next decade or so. because of what he's done with this Minnesota Vikings defense. I feel like this defense coming into the season really didn't have its share of superstars. It was just a bunch of guys, whether it be through the draft or quote-unquote aging out of this team or free agent acquisitions, who really were going to try and come together as some kind of conglomeration that could really help this team transition. This wasn't meant to be a breakout year for the Minnesota Vikings defense, and yet it truly was because of Brian Flores' plans for it. The way he disguised coverages, the way he brought back the years with guys like Harrison Smith, Stephon Gilmore, made Cam Bynum and Josh Metellus vital pieces of his defense, really nicely incorporated these free agent acquisitions in Jonathan Greenard, Andrew Van Ginkel, Blake Cashman into his system as well. He got the most out of this defense, more so than any other defensive coordinator could have possibly done. And as a result, I'm really, really, really thrilled to say that this Vikings defense is primed for the next couple of years. No matter what happens with it, no matter if Brian Flores does end up getting a head coaching job somewhere else, no matter how many pieces might leave, because I'm sure that guys like Smith and Gilmore aren't necessarily looking to extend their stay that much longer, but ultimately this Minnesota Vikings defense has proved that no matter who's out there, they can really, really be an elite NFL defense. And so that's why I'm really stoked for the future of this Minnesota Vikings team, not just because of what they did offensively, because of this defense. If this defense continuously shows that they can perform like this on a consistent basis, then the Minnesota Vikings have all the opportunities to win their first ever Super Bowl in this next decade, even potentially this year. But this defense really, really has surprised a lot of people, but not as much as the number one overall fantasy defense this year. Yes, over the past couple of weeks, they too, much like Pittsburgh, have declined as well. But this Denver Broncos defense, the no-name Denver Bronco defense, much like the Minnesota Vikings, really has shocked a lot of people. Yes, they had the star corner in Pat Surtain II, one of the best cornerbacks in the league, one of the best in terms of man coverage. But it's guys like Zach Allen, Cody Barton, Riley Moss, Jaquan McMillan, who are the unsung heroes of the Denver Bronco defense. Kudos to Vance Joseph as well, another former NFL head coach, much maligned, who ended up being a stellar defensive coordinator this year. I think that's the theme of this top four defense this year. All these much maligned head coaches becoming these fantastic defensive coordinators. But this Denver Broncos defense, number 3 in terms of efficiency. Yes, they had their problems late in the year. Still first in expected points added on defense, first in sacks, third in scoring defense. Ultimately, more in the sum of their parts. They're getting back Riley Moss for this postseason push. It's going to be difficult, but ultimately, I'm really, really thrilled for the future of this Denver Broncos defense, just because of all these no-name pieces really coming into their own, and it's still a young, deep, experienced defense that I'm really excited to see if Vance Joseph continuously improves on it, if he remains in Denver. But ultimately, I'm just so honored to be able to recap this fantasy football season. It's been bittersweet to talk about it in such a way, but ultimately it will come to a close. But see you guys tomorrow for another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network. Remember to make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features as well. But other than that, I'm out until tomorrow. Thank you all for tuning in.